When I first started my Press Play podcast in 2024, the first episode I did was all about the reasons journalists won't provide you with interview questions in advance. It's by far my most downloaded episode, and it continues to be the top downloaded week after week. So for this week, I'm going to go through some of those original reasons, and I'm going to add a few more. We're going to go a little bit more in depth on why not providing those questions in advance is actually helping you and the journalistic process. That's all ahead on this episode of Press Play.
Parents, coaches, and young athletes, are you ready for the media spotlight? Game Ready, media training for aspiring athletes, is your ultimate guide to building a strong personal brand, mastering interviews, and handling social media like a pro. Written by Emmy-winning journalist Jeremy Scot, this ebook gives you the confidence to shine on and off the field. Learn the top mistakes young athletes are making on social media that could impact their future careers. Plus, we'll help you understand how journalists think, the types of questions they might ask your future athlete, and how they can remain calm under pressure. Purchase your copy on the Scot Media Tulsa digital bookstore. You can find it at scotmediatulsa.com. Download your copy today and take your media game to the next level.
Welcome back to another episode of Press Play. I'm your host, Jeremy Scot. I get a common question all the time when I work with media training clients. The question is, can I get interview questions from journalists in advance? There are a lot of reasons why journalists won't give you the questions before you show up for an interview. I'm going to go through my top 10 and explain why it's actually to help you. It's to help keep the conversation authentic and ultimately keep that journalistic process intact. If you listen to my first season of Press Play, you've probably heard some of these before, but I'm going to go more in depth and I'm going to add a few more. So let's get started with my top 10 list. So the number one reason for me that journalists won't give you the questions in advance is because if someone's sitting down for an interview, they really want that to feel authentic and not scripted. If an interview subject knows exactly what questions a journalist is going to ask them, they have time to rehearse almost to a point of where they're just reciting and they're not having a conversation. You want that interview to feel real and feel authentic, and the only way to do that is to have an actual conversation, which does not mean you get the questions in advance. As an active journalist, this is something that I stand by pretty firmly, but I've also done corporate communications. The rules in corporate communications are a little different. You can't ask for those in advance because you're working for the same company. I still advise against it, and I've had some clients in the past push back on that and say, no, we need to have those in advance. One even went so far as to have her answers written down on cue cards, and then she had someone hold them up just off the camera so that she could read them and know exactly what she was saying. For me, that was by far the worst video and interview I've ever done. I hated it at the time. I hate it now. And I don't ever share it because I think it's just terrible. You can tell she's reading. She doesn't sound authentic, and it actually hurt her credibility. I told her I felt like it made it seem like she didn't know what she was talking about, to the point that she had to read it off a cue card because she couldn't remember it. Now, to her point of view, she was nervous. She wanted to make sure she got the key points across, which you can absolutely do during an interview without knowing the questions in advance. But number one reason those questions don't come beforehand is because they want to keep the conversation moving naturally. They want to keep it authentic, and you can't do that if it's rehearsed. If a journalist has agreed to do an interview with you, they are doing some sort of a story around your area of expertise. The story might evolve. So let's say that I've set up an interview with someone on a Tuesday, and that interview is on Friday. That's a lot of time for the details of that story to change, for other circumstances to come forth. And there's a lot of factors that could play into the questions that a journalist is going to ask you once that interview happens several days later. So a journalist is not going to provide you questions in advance because then they're locked into those questions and they don't have the flexibility to evolve their questioning as the story evolves as well. If there's new information that comes out about a product failure or a crisis communication situation from the time they set up the interview to the time you do the interview, the journalist is going to need the flexibility to be able to ask you those questions that weren't originally submitted because they didn't know the details of that at that point. So the journalist will not provide questions in advance to keep the authenticity, to keep that ability to ask questions for new information or evolving situations. It's a key part of the journalistic process, and reporters, producers, journalists are really going to stand by their ethics. They're not going to give you those questions in advance. Journalists are trained to cater to their specific audience. If you are talking to someone who works for a specific trade publication, they're going to know who those readers are, and those are going to be very different people than the people who would watch it on a television news broadcast. So you have to trust the journalist, and that's the third reason why journalists won't give you questions in advance. They know their audience better than you do. They're not going to get your approval on questions because they know that their audience may not care about that. If you are working in finance and you're talking about a new trend with the stock market or with 401ks or whatever, a lot of people who watch television news broadcasts may not have 401ks. They may not invest. And so a journalist is not going to talk to you ad nauseum about those topics. They're going to talk more bigger picture about how what's happening at the stock market might affect people at the grocery store or at the local level. And they're going to do that because they know their audience. They can't give you those questions in advance with what you specifically want because they know that's not what the audience is going to need or understand, and it's going to make you seem out of touch. They're not giving you those questions because they want the flexibility to cater to their audience, which is ultimately who they're reporting for anyway. The fourth reason why journalists aren't going to give you those questions in advance is because they don't want you sending them along to a PR firm who then gives you PR answers for you to rehearse and give back. It kind of goes back to one of the other ones about rehearsing the answers, but this one's a little bit different. I've seen in the past where people will hire a PR firm, request those in advance, they get the questions, send it over to a PR firm that then gives the client very PR answers, which then they regurgitate. It's almost like sending them talking points in an email that they just read in advance. Journalists are trained to spot when someone is dodging the real issue. And that's where I think a lot of people get nervous and they say, well, I want those questions in advance so they don't catch me in a corner or have a gotcha moment. Journalists will sometimes do that when they can see that you're dodging the real answer. So you want to sound as genuine as possible, which is again why they're not going to give you those questions. And speaking of PR firms, if you have hired a PR firm, they are more than likely going to be pitching your story or your interview to multiple outlets. So the fifth reason why journalists won't give you questions in advance is because if they know you're going to be appearing on another outlet or in another publication, they don't want the exact same story and the exact same interview that you gave someone else. So by not providing the interview questions in advance, if you've already done an interview somewhere else, they can look at that and see where that conversation went. For their interview, they're going to take it in a whole new direction. They don't want to repeat the exact same information. They want their interview to be specific and different than everybody else's. So they're not going to give you the same questions so that you have time to give the same answers. Live television is its own little beast, and I've worked in live TV for all my career. And when someone sits down for an interview, it can go a completely different direction than the producer thought, than the reporter or the anchor thought. If you're sitting down for a live TV interview, there's no guarantee that the questions are going to come about in the order that anyone thought. Usually in a commercial break, the anchors will go over some potential topics with the guest right before the live TV interview. But even then, it's not a guarantee that they're going to stick to that 100%. As you start to have a conversation, the anchor may remember something that they never thought of, or you may say something that sparked a new direction in the conversation. They need the flexibility to be able to take that conversation wherever they will, which means that they're not going to stick to those exact questions. They want to take it where it needs to go. Live television can be a lot of fun. It can be a lot of stress for some people. You have to trust the anchor and trust the journalist. They know what they're doing. They're going to lead you along in a way that's going to make the interview look great, but they're not going to give you those questions in advance because they don't know where they're going to go. Speaking of questions not knowing where you're going to go, my seventh reason why journalists aren't going to give you any questions in advance is because genuinely sometimes we don't know what questions we're going to ask you until we sit down for the interview. There have been a lot of times where I've sat down to interview someone and they give me a response that I was never expecting. And as a result of that, I follow up with questions I never even thought about before. I won't provide interview questions in advance because I want the conversation to go where it will, and I'm going to ask follow-up questions based off of what you tell me. I don't know what question I'm going to ask you until you give me your answer. Again, it goes back to having a genuine conversation. But journalists sometimes don't know what questions they're going to ask. If you speak with someone who's really trained and really good at what they do, they are able to come up with those questions on the fly. They don't have to look at their notes. They don't have to go to their own rehearsed bank of questions that they ask when they're kind of in a pinch and they don't know what else to say. A real trained journalist may not know the question they're going to ask you until the moment they ask it. But you have to trust them, you have to know what they're doing, but that's why they can't give you those questions in advance because they truly don't know what they are. Ethics is an interesting conversation for journalists and for the public, but journalists really live by their ethics. And in order to have a fair playing field for all of their interview guests. They have to stick to the same set of rules for everyone. So the eighth reason why journalists aren't going to give you those questions is because they want to ensure fairness on all their interview subjects. They want to make sure that it's a fair playing field for all of their guests. If I were to give questions to one guest, I would have to give them to all. And again, for some of the reasons we've already talked about, I can't do that for a number of reasons. I can't have one set of standards for one guest and a different set for someone else. It's about ethics. Number 8 on the list is they want to keep it fair. If you're doing a recorded segment, you have all the time in the world. If you are doing a live segment, you have a specific amount of time. And so journalists are not going to provide you questions for certain types of interviews because they know they're not going to be able to get through all of them. So let's say you're doing a live television segment that's 5 minutes. You're only going to be able to probably get 3 questions answered at the most, and that depends on how long your answer is. So the 9th reason why journalists aren't going to provide you those questions in advance is because they know they're not going to be able to stick to them anyway. If they give you 6 questions in advance for a 5-minute interview, and one of your answers is 2 minutes, how in the world are they going to get through all 6? What we don't want is the interview guest afterward to be upset that you provided those questions and never asked them on the air. Well, the reason for that is because your answer was way too long and we ran out of time. Producers work to the second. So when you look at a television news rundown, everything is timed out by hour, minute, and second. So that means that the producer is really making sure everything's on time to hit weather on time, to hit the commercials on time, to hit the open at the top of the hour. You have to get out on time. So all that could factor into why your interview might be cut short, but they're not going to give you questions in advance because they may not get to all of them anyway. Journalists are coming to you because you've proven yourself to be a thought leader. You are an expert in your field. You are directly related to the story that they're covering, perhaps. Whatever the case may be, they are coming to you because you are the expert source in that moment, which means generally you're going to know every answer to the questions that they have. And if you are that nervous about not being able to speak about a certain topic, you may not be the best person for that interview. Don't let your nerves get the better of you. You know what you're doing. You know what you're talking about. Just trust that you're going to do a great job, and you are. That's going to come across on camera if you're doing a television. If you're doing a radio interview, you'll hear it in your voice. Project confidence, and you're going to do great. If you're interested in learning more about these reasons, again, go back to my very first episode. If you're watching me on YouTube or on social media, I didn't have video back then. I do now, so you'll have to go back and listen to it old school on a podcast. There's really great information about why journalists won't provide those questions in advance and what you can do to prepare. I also have an ebook with a media planning guide that will help you with prep for interviews. It's available on the Scot Media Tulsa digital bookstore. It's only $8, $7.99. And it also comes with customizable templates that you can use to help you on your journey. You can find that on my website. That's scotmediatulsa.com. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Press Play. That'll do it for this week. We'll see you back next week.